Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today my guest is Professor Jared Wesley, who has written a very provocative Substack column titled Danielle Smith's Electoral Reforms Are Straight from the Trump Playbook. So, welcome back to Energy Talks, Jared.
Good to be back.
This is really interesting, and we're going to get into the bill that the UCP introduced. It was very interesting. Their press release popped into my inbox, and I think it was later that day or the next day, I got your Substack. And when I first saw it, I thought, well, that's not too bad. It looks like housekeeping, as you call it. And then when I read I went, oh, yes, of course. Now I understand. Maybe you could just give us a little overview of why this appears to be housekeeping, but isn't.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this on your show before, but I really am not trained or born and bred as an alarmist, and I've tried to avoid those kinds of terms like Trumpian. I think they do get thrown around too much, and they have lost their meaning to a certain extent. But I think in this case, we do have to call it out for what it is, and there are definite parallels. And this isn't the first time, right? So about 8 months ago, our Common Ground team at the U of A. Was asking the question, how do we make sense of the Danielle Smith legislative agenda? And because the bills that they proposed in the last session in the fall were like out of nowhere. They weren't in the campaign platform. They weren't showing up in public opinion polls about things that Albertans were caring about. And one of our hypotheses was, well, maybe they're borrowing it. Maybe it's policy transfer or idea transfer from somewhere else. And where would they draw it from? And our minds, went straight to red state Republicans. And sure enough, we find fingerprints on word for word, parts of legislation that were in the UCP, in the UCP bills were drawn straight from red states. So this is another case where it appears that there is a strong connection between what red state and Trump Republicans are doing in the United States and here, and it's as I say, straight out of the Trump playbook.
I want to make a point here, and Joanne and I first moved to Calgary in 2000, and so we've had a very strong connection to Alberta for 25 years. And I have a big social network there, and I have some acquaintances who are part of that Wild Rose Party, social conservative, evangelical kind of culture in Alberta. And for years, they've been very casually talking about how the Republican Party, the GOP activists and strategists are coming up to Alberta regularly. They're holding training sessions, weekend seminars to train people in campaign techniques, ideas. And it seems like it's like a pipeline right from the Trump GOP up into Alberta. And I think the fact that you've drawn the connection to Trump and that pipeline that I've seen, it makes sense.
Yeah, they don't even have to come here physically, right? The folks are getting their news from American far right news sources. They're tuning into podcasts where these kinds of strategies are openly talked about, right? I mean, voter suppression, right, is actually like that's the name of the episode in some of these podcasts, and we know that certain Albertans, not a large number, but a certain Albertans are tuning into that. And being political entrepreneurs, they're seizing on these strategies. This isn't anything particularly new. Folks that have studied the far right in Alberta dating back to the 1980s, well, there's always been these fringe groups, right? And they come and they go, they rename and they rebrand and so on. But they were never really successful. Jason Kenney, in a piece that he wrote or that he was quoted in recently, Don Braid article, he said, these groups never really amount to much. They've only ever won one seat in Alberta history and so on. But we live in a different time now, right? Where they actually have access to expertise in how to do this kind of politicking on the ground. And if you're looking for any kind of proof of success and proof of influence, it's Take Back Alberta, right? Who orchestrated the ouster of a sitting premier who was seen to be unassailable at the time. And they've now got their sights set on municipal elections and school board elections in the fall. And it looks like a separatist a referendum as well. What's worrisome, and this is where Bill 54 really raised my eyebrows, was that they're getting the premier's office to make legislative and institutional changes to make it easier for them to do this kind of work. They're allowing more dark money into the process, and they're also, lowering the standards, lowering the thresholds for initiatives and recalls. And, just before we move to the next point too, I mean, we have to keep in mind that this is not just a political movement, right? These far right groups, Convoy included, are multi-million dollar operations. When they ask you to sign up and participate in one of their astroturfing polls where they try to inflate the size of their influence, the size of their membership, they're harvesting data so they can follow up with you and ask you for money later on. And so there's a real capitalist element to this as well that doesn't get a lot of attention.
I have to say, the Rebel News, Ezra Levant and the Rebel News, put me on their mailing list without my permission, and I just stayed on because I was kind of curious what they're up to. Almost every email I get is some manufactured controversy that includes a fundraising pitch to me. And so I understand exactly what you're talking about. Now, you made a point in your column that I really kind of stuck out with me. You said that Bill 54 is the most sweeping rollback of democratic safeguards in Alberta's history. That's a big claim.
Well, definitely in terms of volume, and we're talking about dozens of changes to different pieces of legislation, first of all, and that's nothing new for this government. They tend to use omnibus legislation like Bill 18 and Bill 20, where they package a bunch of stuff together. They also throw out some red herrings, right? That gets the media's attention and distracts from the really more dangerous parts of the bill. So in Bill 18 and Bill 20, it was things like vote tabulators, getting rid of vote tabulators. And then the media's like, oh, well, this is what's with this vote counting? Is this conspiracy theories and so on? Certainly important to pay attention to that. And then in my column, I do mention that as well. But this kind of stuff that flies under the radar, like union and corporate donations being allowed back in, dark money opportunities for politics, removing vouching and bringing in voter ID style laws that will disenfranchise tens of thousands of eligible Albertans. Those are the kinds of things that get lost in these big bills, right? That get people to focus on stuff that is not necessarily the most damaging to democracy.
Well, let's talk about money. And one of the things that occurs to me when I read this, lifting the ban on union and corporate donations, bringing in dark style or dark money, is it's union and corporate. So does that mean that's kind of a red herring because the unions are not going to have anywhere near the resources that the corporate sector will have?
Well, they don't have as many resources to begin with, but also the labor reforms that the Kenney and now Smith governments are moving forward make it even harder for unions to raise money and spend it, right? So this is a false equivalence in that way. I guess what stuck out for me with bringing more corporate money into Alberta politics is just the timing of it. I mean, this is a government that's under investigation with 7 different types of investigation from the RCMP, Ethics Commissioner, Auditor General, several internal investigations, a third-party report into corruption within the government. And they move forward with a bill to bring more corporate money into the system. I mean, this is a government that's under investigation. Again, 7 different ways for pay to play. And they're making it easier for people to pay to play. I honestly don't understand why Albertans are not more upset about this.
Well, you draw a link to the U.S. Citizens United landscape, and that I think has been flagged over and over again in American politics as one of the reasons why it empowered Trump, and it's done a lot of damage to their politics and their culture. But you made the direct connection to it.
Yeah, and the thing that gets missed in the Citizens United decision is that it didn't just empower Republicans who tend to do well with the corporate community. It changed the way the Democratic Party in the United States behaved as well, because now they have incentives to reach out for corporate support and to engage in dark money fundraising and spending. And so, you have to look at the impact of these changes. It's not just going to be on the way that UCP and UCP supporters and donors behave, but what does it mean for the New Democrats? If they want to be part of this game, they're going to have to shift their strategy, which could very well shift their culture.
I see. So basically, making all political parties pretty much have to go to the corporate community, then people who donate lean on the political parties and lobby them and get access to them in a way they wouldn't have otherwise.
It's clear pay to play, and there's no democratic system in the world that's completely free of it. But the UCP is one of the few governments that's making it easier.
Well, look, let's go on to the next one. Ban vote counting machines. This seemed pretty housekeeping and innocuous when I read it, but why is it a problem?
Well, vote tabulators aren't even used in provincial elections, or if they are, they're being used very sparingly. They're used in municipal elections, but in the fall, the UCP got rid of that ability. And it's tied together with some of the other vote suppression elements of Bill 54 and earlier Bill 20. And it's all based on this premise that there is some amount of voter fraud happening out there that we need to push back against in order to restore integrity in the electoral process. There is no evidence of widespread voter fraud in this province. There's only been 12 instances of voter fraud over the last 10 to 15 years in this province, and some of those were connected, and none of them had to do with any of the measures that we're talking about implementing. It had nothing to do with voting machines, had nothing to do with people that were vouching for other people because they forgot their ID or didn't have access to ID. And so the worrisome part of this section of the bill, or those components of the bill, is that it's just reinforcing people's mistrust in the system. There's already a lot of people that listen to what happened in the United States and think that that 2020 election was stolen. And now we're just planting seeds, and we're actually legitimizing that view that, yeah, Canadian elections are just as susceptible to that kind of nefarious behavior when there's no evidence that it ever has been.
I interviewed Professor Dwayne Brett from Mount Royal University early last week, I think it was, about the Canadian electoral system. And he went on and said, look, it's one of the best in the world. And I think that we saw the evidence on Monday that appears to be true. I mean, there were no allegations. The CPC leader, Pierre Poilievre, accepted the results, stepped down. No, there were no accusations of rigged elections. And the Alberta system doesn't seem to be that much different. So, I mean, our electoral system is as robust as one could expect. That's the
It
fact of
is,
it, right?
yeah, it is, and it's worked. I mean, one of the elements that a lot of typical Albertans or mainstream Albertans bristle against when I tell them about voter ID laws, they usually go, actually, the system works quite well. What's wrong with just requiring everybody to bring photo ID to the ballot booth with them, right? And to make sure that we know who's voting. That seems quite obvious. And I remind them that this new restriction that's being brought in will exclude up to 50,000 by our estimates, 50,000 people who are eligible to vote, right, would be excluded from voting because they don't have government issued ID. And folks respond with, well, how it's easy to get ID. You need ID to buy liquor. You need ID to do a whole bunch of things. And I said, yeah, but buying liquor isn't a constitutional right, right? And there's a bunch of people that use vouching, not systematically, but because they forget their ID on one day or they lose it. For example, in cases of intimate partner violence, somebody may have to flee a house or a home without any form of ID. Are we saying that we're okay with excluding those people from participating in the democratic process? There are all kinds of accounts of social workers who block off election day to make sure that their houseless clients have somebody that can show up to the polls with them so that they can cast a ballot through vouching. I remind people, tens of thousands of otherwise eligible Albertans will be unable to cast a ballot in the next provincial election. And how many people are we preventing from voting fraudulently? And the government has never answered that question because they don't have any evidence that this is actually a problem. They're inventing the problem so they can come up with a solution for it. And they think that it is going to prevent their opponents from voting. I don't think anybody believes that houseless people are necessarily in the UCP base. But I would caution United Conservatives by looking at what happened in the UK when they brought in similar types of voter ID reforms. First of all, Boris Johnson, the most recognizable person in that country, was barred from voting when he showed up without ID. That's kind of funny, you're right. But if you take a look at what happened in those municipal elections, the Tories lost a lot of seats and lost control of a lot of local councils because seniors and rural folks who don't have those kinds of ID, that just have historically just shown up because the person taking their ballot knows who they are, weren't able to vote. They lost. And it's not unfathomable here in Alberta. This could very well backfire for the UCP.
No, that's a very interesting point. Let's talk about making recalls easier. What are the changes here?
It's for both recall and initiating citizen plebiscites. It's reducing the total number of signatures that you need in order to spark up a province-wide vote or a constituency-wide vote to recall somebody.
And what are the implications of that? What are like how does that undermine democratic processes?
Well, it makes it easier to put pressure on local representatives, be they school board trustees or MLAs. And this is a tactic that again, red state Republicans have used quite often to threaten not progressives. This is again not threatening progressive representatives, threatening moderate conservatives. Right. So this is a way, and this has been asked for by Take Back Alberta and similar groups. We want to be able to hold the centrists in line, and we want to be able to, in American terminology, we want to be able to primary them whenever we want to primary them and make sure that they stay in line. Because folks that are well organized and have a large membership roll can start to collect signatures. I'd argue it's still a high bar. Yes, it's lowering that bar. It's still a very high bar in order to get there, but lowering that bar might allow groups that tried to, for example, recall Mayor Jody Gondek and failed. You can guarantee that those are the same folks that went to the Premier's office and go, we want it to be easier next time we want to try to primary somebody, right? And so that's the connection. And that's why it's worrisome.
What about lowering the bar for referendums?
Yeah. Again, the bar is still fairly high, but it's more the symbolism of that one. Right? It's the day after, people have to remember, Bill 54 was introduced the day after the federal election. A federal election during which Preston Manning went public and said, if you vote in a Liberal government, it will result in secessionist movements here in Alberta, or will result in an unprecedented national unity crisis. That's Premier Smith's words. So the day after the election, they announced this and say, we're going to make it easier for folks to have votes that would push us in that direction. She dismissed it as just being coincidence that she introduced it that day. Nobody buys that. This is a clear signal to those groups that she's sympathetic to them. And people are kind of dancing around whether Danielle Smith is a separatist or not. We know for a fact that some of her chief advisors are leaders of that separatist movement. I mean, they have written what's called the Free Alberta strategy, which is a roadmap to separatism in Alberta. That appears like these types of moves would be straight out of that particular playbook. So that's the worrisome part. It's not necessarily the logistics, and we can get caught up in the how many signatures and so on. It's the clear signal that she's open to those types of moves. And people might say that there's not enough people around to sign signatures or to let alone vote yes in a referendum. And to that I say, well, not now. But just ask David Cameron in the UK how that went when he was making similar calculations and when he called a Brexit vote. Sometimes these things get out of our own control, right?
Andrew Coyne of the Globe and Mail responded to Preston Manning's op-ed, April 2nd op-ed it was, and he said, at least if you're going to make this argument, you should have the votes. Because, I have an Angus Reid poll, for example, it shows 25% support for separatism in Alberta. But I think Take Back Alberta, if nothing else, showed us how things can change in a hurry when people get organized. And I would imagine that's the fear here, is that, sure, there might be only 25% support for separatism now, but Preston Manning gets behind it, the Premier gets behind it, their machines get behind it, and 2 years from now, maybe that's 35 or 40% or more. Is that the worry here?
Yeah, well, you don't need to look that far back in time. I mean, look at the sudden swing in support in this last federal election.
Yeah.
Swung 20 points, right? So, and what drives that is not policy debates. So we could talk about the ins and outs of what it would take to separate and the impact it would have on the economy. By the way, that's what's missing from this discussion so far, is that in the lead up to the 95 and after, for decades after the 95 referendum in Quebec, investment in that province dried up because it was such an unstable community. But we won't get into discussions about that. It'll come down to identity politics. It'll come down to fundraising, and it'll come down to grassroots support. Again, something that the Premier has taken steps to making easier for for groups like Take Back Alberta to dominate those kinds of discussions. So yeah, I don't want to be a fearmonger or an alarmist about this, but I think people are being a little complacent if they take a look at polls and go, yeah, they're still 20 or 30 points away from having a majority in support of separatism. David Cameron will tell you the risks of resting on your laurels in that sense.
An important point you made in your column is that individually, any of these changes, might not be that damaging or potentially damaging. Cumulatively, sorry, my tongue can't wrap around that word today. But the cumulative effect, that's what we should worry about.
Yes, it's the cumulative effect, which is clearly indicative of a pattern of stealing from the Trump playbook, certainly. But if you take all of them together, it actually, makes it harder for opponents of this government to push back against future reforms that would be even more draconian, right? I mean, you start this is yet another piece of legislation from the UCP that amounts to the government getting to pick its voters, as opposed to voters getting to pick the government. And the more they do that, the harder it will be for opponents, whether current opponents, let alone future opponents, to push back. And that's by design. That is absolutely by design.
And when you say that there's an underlying playbook here, which corresponds very, very closely to the Trump playbook, the MAGA playbook in the United States, and why is it that Albertans aren't thinking about how this is being done by design? Is because there's no public debate around it? It's taking place in the back rooms or wherever, the UCP is coming up with its strategy. Is that the issue?
I think it's apathy. Albertans aren't like any other Canadians. They're tuning away from mainstream news, and most of them probably don't know a lot of the stuff that we're talking about even happened, right? We know that from our surveys that most people get, this is a little weird. Most people get their news from Facebook. That's the most common news source for Albertans. Real news, like legitimate journalism, is not found on Facebook because it's barred, right, by Meta, right? So people are getting these kinds of these bits of information from friends and family on Facebook. Certainly, I don't disagree with that, but they're getting that through a filter, right? And what we know from research on the far right, but also research on this most recent campaign, is that those same outlets that you talked about, Rebel News, True North, yeah, they are the ones that are getting very good at getting around the Meta restrictions and getting their voice and their framing out to people. So it's not surprising to me that most people, if they even knew about some of the things we're talking about, are getting the framing like it's only housekeeping. Don't worry, right? Voter ID, not a problem. It makes sense just to have a piece of ID. Everybody should have a piece of ID, right? That's the only side that they're getting to this. So people are either unplugged from the situation entirely, or they're getting fed one particular perspective.
Jared, this has been fascinating. Why don't we wrap up the interview by you giving us your assessment of the risk to democracy in Alberta of these kinds of actions?
Yeah, as I say before, that this is this is only the most recent in a number of shifts that Danielle Smith and the UCP have done in the Trump-like direction, and for years, for months, I've avoided using the Trump label, but it's time that we call it out for what it is, and not be afraid of doing that, right? I made arguments before, even before the last provincial election, that the UCP is now an authoritarian voice force here in Alberta. And some of my colleagues say, "Oh, aren't you being alarmist? Aren't you like turning more people away from it?" No, we need to do this eyes wide open. We need to start using terminology that people understand, and we need to bring evidence of why we're saying this. So it can't just be dismissed as somebody's opinion, right? There's clear evidence that what we're seeing in the United States is happening here in Alberta, and that the more this happens, the harder it will be for Albertans to push back. People often ask, "What can you do in the face of this?" The answer is to call up your MLA. And a lot of people say, it doesn't do any good. They're a conservative or they're in the opposition. It really doesn't matter. They're already with me or they're already against me. That is absolutely categorically untrue. The UCP has done U-turns on policy in the past, and it's been due not to public opinion polls, not to folks like me and you talking about this stuff. It's because people call their MLA, or write them, and they do not engage in the type of astroturfing activity like copying and pasting email language and sending form letters into their MLA. Those things are dismissed. But handwritten letters, phone calls from people that have never called up their MLA before, those have traction. We've talked with constituency assistants in this province and elsewhere. And they say when they get a phone call from somebody, they can usually assume there's about a dozen other people that are too busy, but share that opinion. When they get a handwritten letter, it's 40 to 50 times is what they're estimating people, the number of people that are upset about this. So if Albertans don't want to see us go down that path, there is still time for now, but it requires you to get off your duff and call up your representative. That's what democracy is based on here.
Well, I'm going to close this show by saying that viewers, later this morning, I'm going to be releasing a 4 or 5 minute video where I take Preston Manning and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith to task for their separatist ideas, arguing that they represent kind of a 20th century approach to energy in particular, and not the 21st century approach that we need in Alberta, which would require a partnership with the Canadian government to put in place the infrastructure spending and other things that we need. So on that note, just watch for that video later. And Jared, thank you very much.
Thanks. I hope we don't have to do this again. I really do. I hope we can stop it through conversations like this, but maybe we can meet next time under better circumstances. How about that?
We can only hope.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.